Greetings, I'm Deletna Dawalko here with your daily news. U.S. Department of State reiterated its condemnation of the government of Ethiopia's expulsion of 7 UN officials. The UN's humanitarian chief, Martin Griffiths, believes the crisis in Ethiopia is a stain on our consciousness. The UN welcomes the arrival of additional trucks to Tigray this week and continues to urgently call on the government of Ethiopia to allow and facilitate an unimpeded entry of supplies and equipment, including cash and fuel, into Tigray. A group of prominent Africans from various professions call for an immediate end to the violence in Ethiopia. U.S. Department of State reiterated condemnation of the government of Ethiopia's expulsion of 7 UN officials. In a press briefing given by the spokesperson Ned Price, U.S. Department of State called for an immediate reversal of this decision. We urge the government of Ethiopia to collaboratively work with the UN and international partners to allow and facilitate safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all that are in need, and even a long-standing call of ours, he said. Ethiopian Prime Minister admits the ongoing war is exacting heavy price. Associated Press reported that Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was sworn in on Monday to run a country in the grip of a nearly year-long war against Tigray forces. The Tigray conflict has made us a heavy price, Abiy told a crowd in the capital of Addis Ababa, and he bristled at the international pressure as concerns grow over the war's human toll, and saying that there are those who showed us their true friendship and those who betrayed us. He didn't name any names. The AP report said Abiy now faces a major challenge as war in Tigray and region spreads into the other parts of the country. Deadly ethnic violence continues, and watchdogs warn that the repressive government practices are on the return. According to AP, a handful of visiting African leaders urged them to hold things together, and the government is under growing pressure as people begin to starve to death in Tigray under what the UN has called a de facto humanitarian blockade. Last week, UN humanitarian chief told the Associated Press that the situation in Ethiopia is a stain on our consciousness. The U.S. has threatened further sanctions if humanitarian access in Tigray isn't granted soon and warring sides don't take steps towards peace. Thousands of people have been killed in the war waged between Tigray forces, who once dominated the national government, and Ethiopian allied forces. 7 major opposition movements opposed to the ruling Prosperity Party formed a united front. The new front says it does not recognize the illegally constituted government by the self-acclaimed Prosperity Party. The Afar Revolution Democratic Unity Front, Agaw Democratic Movement, the Benishangul's People's Liberation Movement, the Global Qamant People Right and Justice Movement, or the Qamant Democratic Party, Sidama National Liberation Party Front, Somali State Resistance, and Tigray Regional Government, or Tigray's People Liberation Front, formed the coalition called United Front of Ethiopian Federal Forces. The new front has released a statement in which underlined the reason for the formation of the coalition as a response to the myriad crises facing the nation and aimed at reversing the harmful effects of Abiy Ahmed's rules to our people. The statement said the current deteriorating political, social, and economic situation is leading the country down the path of disintegration with a serious consequence for the region and beyond. The United Front of Ethiopian Federalist Forces is aligned on the mutual struggle for the democracy, equality, and self-determination. The statement said, adding that its members have agreed to establish a joint command for all-round activities. The coalition said it will jointly work towards an all-inclusive national dialogue and the establishment of a transitional arrangement with the view of addressing the political crises affecting the country. The front said it does not recognize the illegally constituted government by the self-acclaimed Prosperity Party based on the sham election to which the main opposition parties in Ethiopia were denied participation, and the United Front of Ethiopian Federalist Forces reject in the strongest terms and shall consider null and void any attempt to tamper with the existing constitution in any form. According to analysts, Ethiopia has formed a new government in the absence of one of the 10 members of its federation. Tigray, through flawed and processed electoral amidst multi-layered crises. Timnit Bayru has more.
The government of Tigray has strongly condemned the decision of the Ethiopian government to expel 7 high-level United Nations officials. In a statement issued last Friday, government of Tigray called the Ethiopian government's decision unprecedented and alarming. The statement added, the decision is very much in line with the activities of the Ethiopian regime, which has consistently hindered the delivery of humanitarian aid and violated international humanitarian and human rights laws for the last 11 months, including by expelling humanitarian organizations like Doctors Without Borders and the Norwegian Refugee Council, as well as the Al Khartoum Foundation. The statement of the government of Tigray noted that since the onset of the war on Tigray, and particularly after experiencing military setbacks in June that forced the Ethiopian National Defense Forces to retreat from Mekelle and large parts of Tigray, the Ethiopian regime has orchestrated a man-made famine through the systematic and deliberate destruction of livelihood and a total blockade on all essential goods and services into Tigray. The decision to weaponize starvation to collectively punish the people of Tigray was publicly articulated by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, in which he blamed the people of Tigray for the defeat suffered by his forces and declared that the federal government could not be expected to render services or aid while they sided with the TPLF. The government of Tigray said it is alarmed that the same regime which has invited a foreign army to devastate its own country is now cloaking its decision to expel the officials in the language of sovereignty. The government of Tigray urged the international community to accept humanitarian government's latest assault on established humanitarian norms as refutable evidence that the Ethiopian government is committed to its course of action, namely to weaponize starvation against millions of Tigrayans in a bid to annihilate what Abiy Ahmed considers to be a troublesome ethnic minority. Statement by the government of Tigray appealed to the United Nations Security Council to invoke UNSC Resolution 2417 and all other relevant protocols without delay to address the 11-month humanitarian crisis and to enact a regimen to address the gross violation of humanitarian and human rights precepts by the Ethiopian government. Every day of inaction by the world is another day in which hundreds of innocent children, women, and men perish needlessly from a man-made famine. Reuters reported that the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, has told Ethiopia's Abiy Ahmed that he rejects staff expulsions. The UN Secretary General Guterres told Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed on Friday that his organization does not accept Ethiopia's decision to expel 7 senior UN officials as famine looms in the war-torn Tigray region. Ethiopia declared the officials persona non grata on Thursday and gave them 72 hours to leave. But UN spokesperson Farhan Haq said the doctrine cannot be applied to staff of the world body and thus Ethiopia has no legal right to take that action. Haq said the officials remained in the country. In a note to Ethiopia's mission to the United Nations in New York seen by Reuters, the UN Office of Legal Affairs said it had not received any information to support Ethiopian government's accusation that the officials were meddling in internal affairs. Ethiopia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs later on Friday accused the UN officials of diverting aid and communication equipment to the Tigray People's Liberation Front, violating security arrangements, failing to demand the return of aid trucks deployed to Tigray, and spreading misinformation. Guterres told the UN Security Council on Friday in a letter also seen by Reuters that the United Nations would push Ethiopia to permit these critical UN staff to resume their functions in Ethiopia and grant them necessary visas. The Ethiopian government, however, has continued with this intransigence. Ethiopia's mission to the United Nations in New York told Reuters that Abiy Ahmed's government is urging the UN to expeditiously replace the expelled personnel. The Security Council held emergency closed consultations on Tigray's humanitarian crisis and expulsion order, but took no action.
The UN's humanitarian chief, Martin Griffiths, this week told the Associated Press that crises in Ethiopia is a stain on our consciousness, and as children and others starve to death in Tigray under what the UN calls a de facto government blockade. Just 10% of needed humanitarian supplies have been reaching Tigray in recent weeks, Martin Griffiths said. The remarks were one of the sharpest criticisms so far of the world's worst hunger crisis in a decade. Griffiths said memories of the 1980s famine in Ethiopia, which killed around 1 million people and produced images that shocked the world, are vivid in his mind. We fervently hope this is not the case at the present moment. Associated Press, citing witnesses' account and internal documents, last week reported the first starvation deaths since Ethiopia's government imposed blockade in June in an attempt to keep support from reaching Tigray forces. Richard Gowan, UN Director of the International Crisis Group, told AP the UN has worked very hard to maintain good relations with the Ethiopian government throughout the crisis, and some diplomats, including U.S. officials, have felt the UN was able to solicit towards Addis Ababa. But he said Abiy seems to be angry that Martin Griffiths would take such a firm line on the crisis during his recent AP interview. UN Secretary General Anthony Guterres said the UN and its partners are committed to providing aid, but it can't without the adequate humanitarian supplies, including at least 100 trucks a day to Tigray alone, with additional supplies to Amhara, Afar, and other regions. Fuel is also essential to deliver aid and provide critical and service including water, healthcare. Cash is required to pay off the staff and suppliers as well. A ceasefire, political dialogue are urgently needed. He said, warning that the attempts to politicize humanitarian assistance undermine the core efforts of the United Nations to support the people. Guterres also warned that if the current trajectory continues, he fears for the future of many Ethiopian lives and for the stability of the country and the region as a whole. UNICEF calls Ethiopia's expulsion of UN's officials very alarming. The UN Children's Fund says the Ethiopian government's decision to expel 7 senior United Nations humanitarian officials from the country is actually very regrettable and extremely alarming. Declaring its work is more urgent than ever, UNICEF said in a statement Friday that children are bearing the biggest burnt of the country's worsening humanitarian crisis. We have full confidence in the teams working on the ground to save children's lives, guided as always by the principles of the impartiality, humanity, and neutrality and independence. Our programs will continue. UNICEF added, nothing has been present in the African nation for more than 60 years. The 7 officials were given 72 hours to leave Ethiopia. They included the UNICEF's representative and deputy chief of the UN Office for Humanitarian Affairs. In a tweet, Ethiopia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that the 7 were meddling in internal affairs of the country. The government of Tigray has strongly condemned the decision of Ethiopian government to expel 7 high-level United Nations officials. Timnit Bayru has more.
According to Addis Standard, Ethiopia has formed a new government in the absence of one of the 10 members of its federation, Tigray, through flawed electoral process amidst multi-layered crises. Addis Standard yesterday said that the polls that led to Abiy Ahmed's election were marred by irregularities and a full-fledged war in Tigray and violence in other parts of the country. For the first time since the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia was constituted in 1995, Ethiopia formed a new government in the absence of one of the 10 members of its federation, Tigray State, and in the backdrop of an incomplete electoral process. The electoral process featured scandals ranging from irregularities in both candidates and voter registration process to cancelling of poll stations to the electoral board dispute with Harari region. In the Somali region, 7 constituencies were tainted by voter registration irregularities. In Addis Ababa, opposition parties complained of irregularities in the process, and in Oromia, residents complained of forced registration. Days before elections, the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia cancelled and postponed voting in a number of constituencies across 6 of the regional states. Nonetheless, the ruling Prosperity Party claimed a landslide victory where elections in the Somali, Harari, Southern Nations, Nationalities, and Peoples regions only took place 3 days ago on September 30th, 2021. The Addis Standard supported their claim with the U.S. statement that Ethiopia's electoral process was not free and fair for all Ethiopians and called for inclusive political participation to move the country forward. The boycott of the elections by opposition parties, the detention of vocal political leaders, and the ongoing violence in multiple parts of the country underscored the need to launch an inclusive effort to build a national consensus on the governance of Ethiopia that preserves the sovereignty and unity of the state and strengthens the constitutional order. The establishment of the new government comes despite the absence of the biggest opposition parties in Oromia and Somali region. All of the Oromo Federal Congress, Oromo Liberation Front, and Ogaden National Liberation Front withdrew from the elections. It also comes only 4 days after the second round of elections were held in Somali, Harari, and several constituencies in other regions, as well as before the conclusion of the South-West Regional State referenda. It is noteworthy to mention that Tigray Regional State is not represented also in the federal government. The Addis Standard also mentions U.S. impending sanctions, including the threat to delist Ethiopia from the list of countries benefiting from the AGOA privileges, and diplomatic isolation from the rest of Ethiopia's traditional Western allies, as challenges adding these all are continued in the government's ability and willingness to enter into a negotiated ceasefire with Tigrayan forces to end the 11-month-old war that has until now rippled the country apart. Whether Prime Minister Abiy prioritizes peace over his reputed slogan of prosperity is yet to be seen, as Addis Standard concluded.
OSHA reports that the delivery of humanitarian supplies, including fuel into Tigray, remains heavily constrained through the only road access route in Afar. In the past week, 79 trucks with humanitarian supplies have arrived in Tigray via the Samara-Mekelle corridor. This brings the total number of humanitarian trucks that have entered Tigray since the 12th of July to the total of 606 trucks. There's still a denial of access into Tigray for trucks with fuel, medical supplies, with trucks waiting in Samara moving to Mekelle. Commercial supplies have been blocked since the 28th of June, causing severe shortages of essential commodities and a sharp rise in prices. The price of cooking oil has increased 400%, salt by 300%, rice by 100%, and teif by 90%. Humanitarian partners continue to respond to urgent needs in Tigray, but with significantly reduced capacity due to the depletion of stocks as well as resources. Between the 16th and the 22nd of September, partners provided food to more than 126,000 people, but more than half of these people received less food than planned due to the shortages of stocks, and in comparison, more than 242,000 people received food assistance a week earlier. At least 5.2 people need food in Tigray at the moment. The UN and its humanitarian partners continue to scale up the humanitarian response in the conflict-affected areas of Afar and Amhara region. The World Food Programme provided food to more than 52,000 internally displaced people in Afar and more than 163,000 people in Amhara. International NGO partners also provided food to more than about 201,000 people as well as in Amhara region. The UN welcomes the arrival of additional trucks to Tigray this week and continues to urgently call on the government of Ethiopia to allow and facilitate an unimpeded entry of supplies, equipment, including cash and fuel into Tigray. A group of prominent Africans from various professions call for the immediate end to the violence in Ethiopia. The professionals across advocacy include people in media, sports, arts, entertainment, made the call in an open opinion piece in the Washington Examiner under the title, "Where is the Outrage for Ethiopia?" The group includes Isha Sisai, a renowned journalist and CEO of OK Media, Mesai Ujiri, president of the Toronto Raptors and co-founder of the youth sports organization Giants of Africa, conflict in Benga Akabe, an actor, and Liz Agbor-Tabi, vice president for global policy, government affairs, and global citizen. The group urged the warring parties to allow humanitarian access to affected regions. They also called the African Union, the UN, and the United States government to redouble their pressure on the warring parties to help ensure a negotiated resolution to the regional conflict in Ethiopia, justice for the victims of sexual violence, and the lifting of restrictions on the media. They expressed their frustration that the worsening day-to-day suffering on the ground cannot trigger public outcry and a united stand from our global leaders as they have hoped. We have watched in horror as our humanitarian groups have sounded the alarm about multiplying accounts of Ethiopian military, along with allied troops with neighboring Eritrea, various supporting militia, claiming the bodies of Tigray women and girls as an extension of the battlefield. Where this should have been a bold action, there has been largely silence and half measures, President Joe Biden's timid authorizations of broad sanctions among them. Calling Abiy Ahmed as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, who is presiding over a humanitarian catastrophe, they said they are not yet to see an international joint commute could bring this devastating violence to an end. This has been your news for the day, and we'll have more for tomorrow. Goodbye.